Pablo. All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Name's Pablo Breuer. If you're on Twitter, I go by Angry Hobbit. Talk a little bit about why it's all snake oil, and that may be okay. So, any vendor salespeople in the crowd? Good, because you're not going to like me very much. So, mandatory disclaimer. Views are my own. They don't represent the views of my employer. As a matter of fact, my employer doesn't even know I'm here. They'll get to find out when the YouTube video gets posted by Adrian. That'll be interesting. So why are we here? We're here because, frankly, most InfoSec professionals are not computer scientists. They just kind of fell into it, or they were enthusiasts. Some have some formal education, some not. But computer scientists get a lot of computational theory, and computational theory allows us to detect snake oils. So, let me know if you've ever been part or heard this discussion. Boss comes in, he says, breaches are just costing us too much, we can't afford it. So Slick Willie the contractor comes by and he says, hey, come buy our next-gen box full of zero-day detection, right? And we start to get a little bit hopeful, right? Really? You can detect O-days? Totally do it, boss. Totally detect O-days. Really? You're going to keep me safe? And then they launch into this spiel with a bunch of marketing speak, with a bunch of pew-pew technology that you don't understand and doesn't really explain what the product does. Regardless of that, we give them our money. And then a couple of months later, an APT comes along, and that's what our network looks like. So I went to a bunch of vendor websites in preparation for this talk, and I found all of this great language. Can somebody tell me what any of this crap means? Because none of it tells me what the product does or how the product works. So this good-looking guy right here is a guy named Alan Turing. Some of you may have seen a really bad movie with him recently. Alan Turing basically came up with the math that is the basis for all the computers that you run. All of them. And a Turing machine is just an abstract machine used in mathematics to prove fundamental limitations on mechanical computing. This is how I prove that your problem can or cannot be solved by a computer. And something is said to be Turing complete if it's theoretically capable of expressing all the tasks accomplished by a computer. So if you're a computer scientist, you get to spend a wonderful semester learning something called automata. It is really painful math notation, but what it really is a field of discrete math that studies computers and the problems that can be solved by them, and more importantly, the problems that cannot be solved by them. Ever. So in very generic terms, automata splits problems into three categories. They're either solvable, easy, intractable, meaning that they're hard and we have to make a lot of assumptions, or they're undecidable and therefore impossible. You will never, ever, ever be able to solve these problems with a computer. They're just not capable. So let's talk about an intractable problem. The first intractable problem that most computer scientists get is something called the traveling salesman problem. Fairly straightforward. Given a list of cities and distances, what is the shortest possible route that visits each city exactly once and then returns to the originating city? Seems fairly straightforward, but it turns out that for computers this is an intractable problem. And your running time is a factorial of the number of cities that you've got. So imagine that you're a salesman and you've got to go from San Francisco to New York. That is a ton of cities. The sun will burn out before the computer finds you the optimal solution. Now somebody out there is getting ready to throw the BS flag, and they're going to tell me that, hey, that sounds a lot like my GPS works. And you're right. It is how your GPS works. But your GPS works because it makes a bunch of assumptions. It assumes things like interstates are faster than rural routes are faster than farm roads, and then you may tell it some things like, hey, don't show me any toll roads. Sometimes these assumptions are good, and if the assumptions are good, you have a workable but non-optimal solution. What does non-optimal mean? Well, in the security world, non-optimal means you're going to have type 1 and type 2 errors. You're either going to have false positives, or worse yet, false negatives. So let's move on to an intractable problem. Let's talk about proofs by contradictions. So certain problems are mathematically provable to be undecidable and cannot be solved by computers. Again, ever. So, oftentimes vendor will come to us and they will make assumptions or make claims that they have solved a bit difficult problems. Here's how you handle that. Let's assume that they have. Let's take them at their word. And imagine that we can take their solution that they're trying to sell you, and package it into a chip. If we can then use that chip to solve a provably undecidable problem, we've got a contradiction. And if I can't solve that undecidable problem, then they haven't solved the problem that they've suggested that they can solve. So there's the halting problem, fairly straightforward. Given an arbitrary machine M and language W. Oh, my picture's missing with a very confused baby. All right, let's try the English edition of the halting problem. Here's what it says, very simply. Given an arbitrary computer program and input, you will never be able to determine with a computer if it will finish running. And if you think about it logically, this is very straightforward. It's either going to finish, yay, or it doesn't. And the problem comes in when it doesn't finish. If it doesn't finish, maybe it's still running, or maybe it's stuck in an infinite loop. And you will never know. At some point, you may decide to break the program after, say, 30 days. But what if it needed 30 days and 1 minute to finish processing? You're never going to know, and that's the problem. So let's get back to our vendors. Vendor's going to come to us and going to say, we detect all 0 days. And what we hear is, we detect all 0 days. All right, let's assume that's true for a minute. Let's take that 0-day detector, let's put it in a chip, and let's put it in our halting problem. And then let's redefine the halting problem this way. If it's a 0 day, we'll halt. And if it's not a 0 day, we won't halt. So we've solved the halting problem. But we can't solve the halting problem at all, ever. Mathematically provable, 100%. So if you can't solve the halting problem, and I can use your chip to solve my halting problem, you haven't solved your problem either. So there is no 0-day detection, and there won't be. Ever. All right, so no O-day detection. All right. So how do vendors claim this? Well, they claim that because they can detect some 0 days. And some of them can. They've got some really smart people that work at these vendors, and they do it using signatures and heuristics and statistical models. And yeah, you can detect some things like ROP chains on occasion, but you're not going to detect all of them. They make assumptions to reduce the problem space so that they can solve part of the problem. So the trick as a customer is to ask them what assumptions they made and then validate those assumptions. How are you doing what you were claiming that you're doing? What assumptions did you make? And let me make sure that they make sense in my real world. So what about TCP/IP? You're going to get some firewall vendor that's going to show up and talk about their next generation firewall, and they can detect all malicious traffic TCP/IP. Turns out TCP/IP is also Turing complete. Since it's Turing complete, the halting problem applies. Since a halting problem applies, they can't detect all malicious traffic in TCP/IP. So that next-gen product, it may make things better, but it's not a panacea, and it's just going to have different kinds of signatures and heuristics. So for the vendors, first, be honest in your claims. Your customers aren't stupid. We're going to challenge you. Second of all, when we ask you about your assumptions and methodologies, they're not secret sauce. You need to be able to explain it. And if you're uncomfortable with that, then have us sign an NDA. Most of us are going to be fine with that. And for goodness sakes, quit selling us marketing speak. That next-gen cloud-enabled software-defined heuristic-based virtualized threat-centric multi-layer end-to-end analytics adaptive cyber defense pew-pew isn't worth the shiny paper you printed it on. So for the customers, the vendors do have some smart solutions, and that's fine, but they also need to make a living. If the claim seems too good to be true, it probably is. So ask them how they're solving these impossible problems. Ask them how they're reducing the problem space. Ask them what assumptions they made, and then make sure that those things make sense in your operational environment. Most importantly, arm yourselves with a little knowledge. Understand what problems are not solvable by computers and which problems are solvable but are hard. So the next time a vendor comes to you with Brondo the O-Day Mutilator, ask them how they solve the halting problem. For those of you attending RSAC, there's your RSAC bingo cards with your sales terms. I am not responsible if you die of alcohol poisoning while playing. Are there any questions? Please. I do not have ponies. Some of my graphics didn't make it. Any other questions? All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.